I think invisible problems that people are underestimating today. Think of those invisible problems, especially at a global scale, is really decision latency. There's so many organizations out there, and they rely on a human with a spreadsheet to interpret and then to escalate. And in both of those, the interpretation and the escalation can be slow, right? And I think that that's what I consider decision latency. Automation gives you right? The ability to perform at a much more predictable pace, right? So you can have that predictability across both your normal and your abnormal days. And I think once that consistency is established, the gains that you get, again, in accuracy and efficiency, they far outweigh the ability to, handle the manual spikes that you would see in a manual build. A piece of change, right, in just a year is crazy. It's like we do 5 years in a year in supply chain right now, especially with this AI bubble. But I think we touched at it at the beginning of the call, fragmented decisions and data. So I think the non-negotiable, skill is really that systems thinking mindset and really understanding data.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. This is The Summit Speaks. My name is Manjot Singh. I am the CEO and co-founder of Summit Edge. Today, we have Kevin. Kevin is the regional vice president of Lineage, one of the, if not the largest, temperature-controlled logistics companies, where he leads automation and initiatives across America. Before Lineage, he spent several years at Amazon. Kevin and I got a chance to work together. He was actually my leader for some time. We worked around each other in different organizations. He has led several global programs and scaled multiple large network teams. And so very excited to have Kevin on. Today, we'll be exploring robotics and how it's transforming the warehousing space and automation in this industry. So thank you, Kevin, for being on. Looking forward to our discussion. Anything else you'd like to share about your background?
No, appreciate the warm welcome there. Yeah, we had a lot of years of overlap there at Amazon and in our former lives. So it's great to reconnect. Excited to talk today, just a little bit about automation, robotics. And yeah, coming from Lineage, there currently, we are the world's largest global temperature controlled warehousing REIT. We provide temperature controlled warehousing in a vast array of integrated solutions globally. I think the easiest way, if you haven't heard about us, is if you're thinking farm to table, right? We're the two. We're everything in between, production of food and getting it to the end consumer. So
Oh,
definitely
that's awesome.
excited to talk a little bit about how we enable all the food chain here in North America using automation.
Yeah, well, we eat because of Lineage, so that's awesome. Thanks. So let's kind of kick things off a little bit high level here. So from your vantage point at a global scale, what are some of the invisible problems that supply chain leaders kind of maybe aren't seeing or are underestimating at this point?
Yeah, I think invisible problems that people are underestimating today, especially at a global scale, is really decision latency, right? Or just the lack of decision velocity is another way of saying that. So the time between you had a plan, reality is now changing, and then as an entire organization, you responding. That's what I would quantify decision latency as. And I think leaders tend to think, that they have to be hyper focused on some of those output KPIs. Think of labor costs, service levels, right? Throughput. You have a bunch of lagging indicators. But the harder problem and that invisible problem is really how to see how slowly those signals move through the system. Right.
Right.
So it could be your inventory positions change, right? Labor availability shifts, whatever the problem may be. There's so many organizations out there and they rely on a human with a spreadsheet to interpret and then to escalate. And in both of those, the interpretation and the escalation can be slow, right? And I think that
Right.
that's what I consider decision latency. And really, when we talk about automation, you can use whether it's automated software, workflows, automated processes, or actual automation, hardware, robotics in different cases, right? You can compress that latency
Yeah.
and really
Yeah.
make your data become action immediately. So I think that that's a huge problem that people are underestimating right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think some of the challenge that we find is the data in supply chains is so vast and spread so wide,
So disparate systems. They don't talk right now. So, and
silos
that's
and
where
things.
the human's still important. It's just the speed at which we can connect the dots, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. 100%. Okay. So kind of in that same vein, where and like as you've kind of grown in your roles and spaces, when did you realize that automation was no longer just a competitive advantage, but a requirement in businesses?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in that COVID timeframe, right? And just from a macro standpoint, for me, it's when I realized that like the variability, not the volume spike, right,
Yeah,
is sort of the real enemy, if you will. So I think that's around the COVID timeframe, right, when we saw massive peaks and massive valleys at different times. And I don't think it's necessarily the amount of volume. I think it's just the pace of variability that you see in automation. Then that's not survival anymore. That is, or sorry, it's not competitive advantage. It's survival at that point. So you can design manual processes, operations that handle the volume spikes. And it's usually like heroics, right? We think of a
yeah,
peak at 3PL shipping, right? It's that holiday season, literal heroics to go out there and deliver that 2x for those 5, 6 weeks of the year. But when that disruption it becomes continuous instead of like just one episode a year, and that's what we saw in COVID, and right after COVID, and then after for several years. A lot of those human centered or heroic processes become very fragile, right? So that
yeah.
automation is that consistency, and that's really, at least for me, when I fully bought in, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I think COVID just in general just taught us so many other lessons about the I mean, the fragility in supply chains. No, we didn't we always knew that things would move, but COVID just exposed those gaps of like, okay, we actually have a procurement gap. We have a forwarding gap. We have a transportation gap. Like there's so much exposure that brought, and I think now as we kind of live in this new world of AI and automation and robotics coming into the picture, there are some firms that are still very much tied to the idea of sticking to their original standalone processes. But now with automation and robotics, like people are basically increasing their ROI significantly and also automating a lot of processes throughout their business. So I kind of wanted to kind of shift to that portion because some of these things are very significant upfront costs, right? Like and it's a very
Huge
significant.
capital,
Yeah,
huge capital intensive deployments, right? It's both
yeah.
on the software and the hardware side.
Totally, exactly, and then just not to mention the change management that brings about through the organization. But what are some of those misconceptions that executives have around automation and robotics and ROI?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? And that many of us, right, may have around robotics ROI. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions, right, is looking at the ROI purely in labor reduction. That's where labor is, generally the largest expense for most, especially when we think warehousing, 3PLs. Your labor is your biggest expense, right? So you think robots need to reduce labor. And I don't think that that's inherently always going to be the case. I think that we're going to upskill in many cases labor to actually support or work alongside robotics. Many people, the robot, you jump to that humanoid robot. It's not always the case, right? There's plenty of other types of robotics and automation that work alongside humans. And I think that the labor maps, right? It's always going to be a huge expense, but I think the real return, it's a little bit harder to measure, right? We like the dollars as the pure output to measure ROI, but the real return shows up in the stability that you gain, the accuracy levels from an inventory standpoint that you can gain by foolproofing a process, fully poke-yoking it, not having human intervention or potential human error, the safety considerations, especially for us in cold storage. When we
Yeah,
take humans outside of the cold, right? There's obviously a safety benefit to that, and then it's just the consistency from a throughput standpoint. So when we reduce that churn, the rework, the damages, right, the injuries, all that has a cost associated with it. And that, in my opinion, can outweigh the direct labor savings. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. People want to measure that ROI and say, how many dollars in labor can I save if I put robotics into my building? And there's other ways of measuring the ROI there.
absolutely. No, I think that was fantastically put.
It's a good question. Manual versus automated. Everybody loves to compare. I think the biggest thing to remember is that they're different, right? When we benchmark, I want to benchmark automation off of automation, manual off of manual. But there is a performance divergence at some point. I think throughput consistency diverges first, right? Manual, we go back to that, you know, heroics example, right? Manual operations can spike. And I think that that's why people really like manual when you compare to automation at times is you can usually handle that variability same day very well, right? So you can spike that through book performance. But then what happens is they struggle to sustain it. Right? And that's what we talked about. All that variability when it's constant becomes very hard to manage. Automation gives you right? The ability to perform at a much more predictable pace, right? So you can
Yeah.
have that predictability across both your normal and your abnormal days. And I think once that consistency is established, the gains that you get, again, in accuracy and efficiency, they far outweigh the ability to, handle the manual spikes that you would see in a manual building.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some of those heroics, like we were at Amazon
We lived
during
it, right?
yeah, during the COVID times, like, you know, and you're right, yeah. So we handled it and overnight sometimes changed our facilities to handle, the social distancing and all these other things. And that's, some of where, you would have problems on the automation side if you wanted to kind of overhaul your system. To your
Yeah,
point, right? It's just not scalable and it's not sustainably scalable. But yeah, those are good memories.
they really are.
Okay, so kind of staying on the vein of automation. So how do you decide which facilities are automation ready and which ones should wait? Like at least on the Lineage side, like how is that decision made?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think especially as you talk about retrofitting, right? So we have built a lot of automation, sort of first warehouses, so they're fully launched right as a greenfield that are autonomous. And I think that's a little bit different than your question, which is how do you know when a facility is automation ready to go in and retrofit or add a level of automation to it? And really, I think it boils down to having the strong fundamentals, right? Having a strong leader in place. So you need your volume to be stable, right? But you need your processes to really be mature. Your systems have to have the credibility, right? And that's your people as well. They have to have the credibility, and then you need the existing infrastructure, obviously, on that side. But that leadership rigor, all their cadences, those things really matter. If you have those fundamentals built in a manual warehouse, you can generally adopt automation pretty well, and that's what I would look for first. Automation is only going to amplify your strong fundamentals, and it's also going to amplify if you don't have strong fundamentals. If something is broken process standpoint, and you introduce automation or introduce an automated software workflow, it's only going to amplify those problems. So if those fundamentals are in place, yeah, you can automate, but you will pay a maturity tax, if you will, and that learning curve will be a little bit steeper and costs quite a bit more than your business case probably had anticipated.
Yeah. Yeah. And, some of that, to your point, right, is not using some of those lagging metrics to make those decisions, some of those leading indicators to make those decisions is very important. And, it's hard to quantify good processes. It's easier to say, your throughput is off from standard, right? So like and if you don't mind, I know this is a little off subject, but like how do you assess that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love the question. So it's something that we tackled very recently. For if you're not familiar, Lineage is a company that just, through COVID, we acquired so many other companies, right? So we had all of
Yeah.
these best practices. And that was a question that we had to tackle as part of our, maturation of the company, our growth. We had to get to a point where it went from best practices to standards. Part of it's documentation. Nobody wants to go out and do the global benchmarking and standards and writing, but that is part of the process. And it's even more important when you're talking about software and hardware and automation and following a process. It needs to be documented. So we went out, we documented the process, right? We have a global standard playbook, which is only as good as if people are reading it, but you have to have full
Right.
circle, right? So we actually have an audit process. We go out, we take people into a building, we audit all of the processes that that building should be following, right? And then assign them a score, have an improvement plan if there's any gaps that are there. So it's a great full life cycle, right? And then as you have change management, you can update your playbook and it becomes a single source of truth, right? We had something very similar in Amazon, as you know, where
Yeah.
it was that life cycle. If I had a question, it's almost the resource. I go and I look and I read the process. It links to, process documentation, SWIs, things of that nature, where your field leadership team can learn from it. But it's also a source of truth. And then you audit as your plan, do, check, act, right, and go out and do it. So, yeah, it's a great point of how do you quantify that the site is adhering to processes, but we actually structured that, standardized it, and we can assign, a percentage that they're adhering to processes today.
Yeah. Before we jump back into some of the automation questions, just staying on this vein here, because you and I philosophically had this discussion while we were at Amazon, and I think it's worthwhile to share with the team is operators. There's an art to operators, right? Like you're dealing with different problems and different nuances.
But yeah,
There's a need for standardization, but but how much of that do you like? How much do you standardize to the point of like, is everything robotic at that point, or when do operators like magic come into the picture?
yeah, it's a really good point. And at the end of this, I want to talk just a little bit of what we're doing with our software because it tackles this problem, right?
Yeah,
At a macro level, speaking in a generality here, you have to know what to automate. You can't automate everything, right? Or you can't standardize everything. So those two things go hand in. You need to standardize to the point where your customer experience is the same. And when I say the same, what I mean is that the standard of care for, if I'm working backwards in the 3PL world for my customers, it needs to be the same consistently across different geographies or buildings. But I also need to have the same level of flexibility that it's not just a yes and no. There are different situations. So what we're really trying to do with some of our software is automate processes that can be automated, and then enable your leadership teams to actually go out and be the leader that they need to be and make decisions, right? Because they're not doing something like handing out work, right? Like I'm not doing a repetitive task where a team member is coming up to me and I'm handing them work. I'm actually now out on the floor conducting Gemba, like walking the process, removing barriers, and identifying opportunities where maybe the standard doesn't make sense in this particular use case for this customer. And we have to iterate and change. It's a great question, right? Yeah, how much do you standardize? I think it depends on your business.
yeah.
But I think that you can over standardize in some areas and then still empower and enable your team to make decisions and be change and thought leaders in other areas. But it's a balancing act for sure.
Uh,
I'm curious, you want to give your philosophy on this one a little bit?
Yeah, no, so yeah, because I think we grew up as operators. I did, from FedEx to Amazon. I think it's about really about like understanding your role in the overall business and not trying to do the heroicism and or whatever we want to call it, the heroic leadership, because it's not sustainable. Be process oriented. So you're really trying to focus on how do I you got to get the whatever it is packages out the door for the day, but how do you build in actual processes? And I think that's what I think the operations leaders really bring to the table that's unique is they, like to your point, if they have good processes, those repetitive processes can be automated, but those nuanced processes like interactions with associates, the safety aspects of it, the culture aspects that are a little bit intangible that you do have to like, do you have a employee of the month, those types of things. And I think that's where operators really come to the mix, and is the building a cohesive culture that brings everybody in and can get them all on the same page to one mission, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
You're spot on, right? People still need to be people, right? They still need to lead
absolutely.
with it. And there is a human element to this that you can't standardize. Um,
Absolutely.
it's not going to happen. So it's a balancing act. You got to find both sides for sure. And I think you were touching on, sorry to cut you off, but you were touching on one piece that I think that's super important. You're saying like operators have to operate, and that part of that is that you have to standardize, right? But you have to also enable your people to be proud of themselves. Like that's why they're there.
Absolutely.
So if you over standardize where somebody feels like they can't go and solve problems, then that
Yes.
sort of entrepreneurial or ownership spirit is gone, and you don't
Yeah.
want to erode that. You
Yeah.
have to keep that alive on your team.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Every organization now has a version of this. At Amazon, we called it day one mentality, you know, uh, but just kind of having that entrepreneurial spirit to your work. And I think operators in general just have so much autonomy. Like when you're in the building and it's your shift and or your building or your region or whatever it may be, it's yours. Like
Oh
there's
yeah.
it's you're responsible for those people in that under the roof or on the road operations. So it is a very ownership oriented, problem solve oriented type of role. And I think that's where like automation kind of, that's where the line is, right? Like you can automate this repetitive side of the business, some of the more like, maybe some of the mundane labor type actions within the business, but the problem solving, the thinking, the innovation, that still needs to come from us for now.
Yes. Now, for now, who knows? AI in the future, but
Who
we'll
knows?
get
Who
there.
knows? But so coming back to this theme of automations, when you're doing these large scale automations, and you actually kind of alluded to this, you had a bunch of acquisitions. You're now trying to standardize. What are some of these mistakes that leadership teams sometimes make that derail some of these automations?
It's a good question. Leadership teams, mistakes that they make, the most commonly derail automation. So, I think when people think of automation coming into their facility as a technology driven initiative, instead of, it's going to be a true operating model change, then they, underinvest in some of the change management, right? They don't own it. It's technology's implementation. It's just going to assist, right? And then we don't know who has ownership. And then we usually tend to overpromise on what the outcome's going to be, right? Because we saw this result in a different facility or whatever it is. So when you don't have the buy-in right from the beginning, that's I think a big mistake. And I think it's just automation isn't going to replace all that discipline, all that process that you had before you had automation. Again, it's what we talked about earlier. It just amplifies it. So
Totally. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's one of the biggest mistakes is sort of they're underinvest in the change management, and then that leads to lack of ownership, and kind of seeing it as a technology initiative versus they're truly owning it from a leadership team standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of this ownership, to your point, I think I was talking to another leader about this, where especially in the supply chain space, a lot of people, especially frontline operators, are worried that this is going to replace their jobs, right? And how would you like? What is your message to them, like for that frontline advocacy? What would you say to folks that are worried about this kind of stuff? And it is a real worry because layoffs are happening, people are worried, but I feel like there's, as we talked throughout this conversation, there's 100% still need for humans in the loop. So what are your thoughts there?
It's interesting. I think that this has come up for a long time, right? And I remember being at Amazon and watching Andy Jassy do a talk, I think with the New York Times. You can find it on YouTube, and he really doubled down on, we're not looking to have these humanoid robots that are going to replace humans, right? We want to make the work safer and really just kind of have something that can assist and help with growth. But I think a lot of companies are at that point. They still have yet to fully see and believe in a humanoid robot that's going to replace a human in the transportation, logistics, warehousing, supply chain space. I just don't know that exists today. And I think automation is more so there to, right, just reduce that physically punishing work, right? It helps you clarify your priorities, and it makes that performance, right, from a customer standpoint, more predictable. So and I give some examples of how we're doing that today. You and I both have examples of how we did that at Amazon in our past life, and how we thought of it. But yeah, that's kind of the my biggest takeaway right there is it's not to replace. It's really to supplement and make the work safer, and make it more productive.
Yeah, and I want to kind of go back to one point that you had made. You had wanted to share something about Lineage's software that automates
Yeah,
some of the decision making. Yeah,
this is like the exact example, right? But whether it's case picking or decision making algorithms, these are things that we've iterated on. We've looked at our process and we said we can provide efficiency here, right? So we can
yeah,
improve the process or streamline it in some cases by reducing, decision making or reducing ambiguity, so that other decisions don't need to be made. So we have, software, for example, that's going to automate tasking and workflow, right? So now instead of we were talking about this just a second ago, but instead of a supervisor having to hand out work, right? We have, a wearable. It's intuitive. It's very task based, but then the workflow diagrams right there. So not just getting your work, but then instead of having to look, okay, this specific outbound needs this. needs this palette plan and loading plan. That's all right on the device now. I don't have to like go to the wall and look and say, okay, let me cross reference this,
Yeah.
this visual element here. So we're building all these workflows in that, they're not there to replace somebody. They're there to help augment their work. And the feedback from our team members has been super positive on taking tasks that were super repetitive, and really helping remove some of the ambiguity and make it more streamlined and make it more efficient for them is really ultimately what we're working on with some of those algorithms.
It's awesome. It's awesome. So, kind of now forward looking here. So, if I am a supply chain professional, if I'm either on the operation side, product side, technology side, what would you say in the next 5 years? What are those non-negotiable skills that I need to bring to the table as we continue to kind of navigate this new world?
Great question. Non-negotiable skills, supply chain professionals, 5 years from now. It's fun because this answer changes like every year, but the
Yeah, yeah.
pace of change, right, in just a year is crazy. It's like we do 5 years in a year in supply chain right now, especially with this AI bubble. But I think we touched at it at the beginning of the call: fragmented decisions and data. So I think the non-negotiable, skill is really that systems thinking mindset and really understanding data. If I could go back, I used to. I'll answer your question a little differently. The question that I get asked a lot is like, would you still do supply chain management? And I probably would, but I probably would have got a degree or a minor in some type of data analytics or
Yep.
software engineering, right? I don't think you need to be a software engineer, but you have to understand data and you have to have a level of data fluency. So I don't think you're going to need to code in the future. I really don't. It's just my personal belief. But you definitely have to understand how decisions, propagate through automated environments, how data works, and how data needs to talk to each other as the different systems talk to each other in the future is going to be more important than ever. And there's so many companies popping up with this. You look at like so many different AI companies having the same mission in the supply chain phase. The biggest name out there, right, is Augur and what Dave Clark is trying to build out there in Bellevue, but there's so many companies that they all see the same problem, which is just
Yeah.
disparate systems, a
Yeah.
very, very slow decision making process across legacy supply chains. And if you want to be the leader of leaders in the future, I think we'll understand that and figure out how to speak it and solve those problems.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it at the beginning, but having the complexity of the ocean of data that you swim in with supply chains, and also, when you think of a supply chain, you might only be responsible for one portion of that chain, but in order for you to make good, accurate decisions, you need data from third parties, unless you're the size and scale of like a Lineage or a size and scale of like an Amazon or something like that, where you do control it from end to end and you have all the data in house. Most other businesses are relying on third party data, and so bridging those gaps sometimes becomes even more complex for if you're building a supply chain ecosystem of this portion, but I need to know on the front end and the back end what businesses are doing in order to make good business decisions for my business. And so I think for the small and medium sized business, that's really where that data fluency and knowing where those problems lie becomes the biggest challenge, right? So to your point, I'm 100% aligned. If I could go back, I would be a data scientist, but in the
Good
supply
job to
chain.
have right now, by the way.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. We always end our podcast this way, but one powerful sentence. What does a fully autonomous, intelligent supply chain look like in 2030, in your opinion?
Yeah. So right back to what we were talking about 5 years. So now, what do you need if you want to be the leader in supply chains? What does the supply chain look like? I think it ties right in. 2030 supply chain is if it was a perfect supply chain, it would be able to sense and correct, right, disruption, I think faster than the disruption was happening, right? So you'd be a self-correcting supply chain. Right now, it's the problem is that we're not responding quick enough in many supply chains, and I think the perfect autonomous or intelligent supply chain of the future can pick out not the lagging indicators but the leading. It'll sense disruption and it'll self-correct. It'll automatically move inventory. It'll automatically unblock labor constraints and make flow decisions that are faster than a human can either identify it or faster than the disruption can spread and ripple across your supply chain. That would be the future 2030 supply chain.
It's phenomenal. And with that, I think I want to thank you again for being on. This was a very, very informative discussion for me. I'm sure for our listeners will be as well. And appreciate you taking the time again. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. I had a great time.
All right. Take care. Bye bye.